Hello everyone, and welcome to our first History 11 lecture. I'm your instructor, Vernon Creviston. And what we're going to be doing in this video is kind of going through the first chapter of our textbook, kind of going through some of the important moments, important points of that first chapter. But before I get into the lecture itself, a couple things I just want you to kind of understand and know about the course. First of all, for this particular chapter, the first chapter of the textbook, I'm going to be breaking up these lectures into a series of smaller video files. But in other chapters, they may be the whole chapter laid out in one big giant video. Could be, anywhere from, 30 to 40 minutes all the way up to an hour and a half in length. For some chapters, like on the Civil War, it could take a couple of really long lectures, long videos, to give you the information that you need to kind of understand a lot of the subject matter that's contained in these chapters. So please do understand that these videos are going to be a little different based on each chapter and kind of the way I want to lay things out and just kind of the time commitments I have for each of those. But the purpose behind these videos is to first give you a sense of what it's like to be in my classroom. I do try to make some jokes, kind of lighten the mood a little bit here without being frivolous or demeaning to the subject matter that we're looking at. Also try to put things in context so it makes a little bit more sense, so you're not kind of just looking at isolated things. If you were to go through our online course and just focused squarely on the assignments that I've given you without really looking at anything else, reading the textbook, looking at these lectures, you could really come away with the wrong ideas in some places, and that could really hurt your grade as well. So in the end, I believe that these lectures are useful to you. They're going to give you some good information. They're going to help you understand what I'm like as an instructor, kind of the things that I want to emphasize for you to understand about History 11, the beginnings of American history. And also to kind of keep things a little bit easier to go through here. I do kind of use a conversational tone, so again, it's kind of a little bit more lighthearted, a little bit more contemporary in my statements, and that's just to make things a little bit more accessible, to make it a little easier to understand and go through with, okay? But I do believe that there are values in these videos, and I would really tell you it would help you get through this course better, do well in this course if you go through and watch these videos on a regular basis, okay? All right, with that being said, let's get into this, our introduction to Chapter 1 and kind of the issues that are involved in it. And again, kind of as I said earlier, History 11 is kind of an interesting subject to teach because, as you can tell by the title slide for this lecture, I have question marks where the title is. And it's an interesting thing to think about, right? When does American history start? When would we have the start of American history? And that's kind of what this introduction is about. When does our history start? Who's involved in it? And where do we go from there, okay? So let's kind of think about that question. Let's kind of consider here, what does it mean, right, to talk about American history? When does it begin? So if you were in my classroom, I would kind of put this up on the screen for you. I would ask you, what do you think? What's the best answer here? Right? Is it A, Columbus discovering the Western Hemisphere? Is it B, when English settlers came to North America and helped create colonies that would eventually become the United States? Is it the Declaration of Independence when we officially announced ourselves as a nation in 1776? Now, all three of those are good possibilities, but they're not where we're going to start this course, right? So in the end, we're going to choose none of the above. So ask yourself why. Why are none of those a good enough place to start American history? Well, the simple fact of the matter is, before Columbus and Europeans showed up, before there was a Declaration of Independence, there was another group of people here, right? And how they interact, how things go between Europeans and these indigenous people, what we call Native Americans, how that plays out has an incredibly important role to play in American history. There really can't be a Declaration of Independence without the English settling in North America. The English are settling in North America because other Europeans are in the Western Hemisphere, started by Columbus, right? They're all getting there because they want land, they want wealth, right? It's about wealth creation, economic forces that are taking place, societal forces taking place. And of course, they're going to dispossess this group of people that are already here. And that confrontation between different Europeans and Native Americans is going to lead to this creation of this thing called the United States. So that's kind of what we need to kind of do, is kind of start our journey at some point, maybe before Columbus. And what I would like to kind of point out to you is that's actually not as set in stone, is not as obvious an idea as you might think, right? So while I'm going to talk to you today in these series of videos for this first chapter of our textbook about the Americas before Europeans and Columbus and all of that starts, right? A lot of people would say 1492 is the place to start. A case in point would be a textbook that I myself used when I was a student here at Fresno State. In the introduction to this textbook, one of the points of it said, for thousands of centuries, centuries in which human races were evolving, forming communities, and building the beginnings of national civilizations in Africa, Asia, and Europe, the continents we know as the Americas stood empty of mankind and its works. This introduction went on to say, the story of Columbus and his arrival is the story of the creation of a civilization where none existed. So in a very real way, this textbook that I used 30 years ago when I was a student is very much saying that American history really begins with Europeans coming to the Western Hemisphere, especially North America. That essentially it was empty, right? It was just kind of a wilderness. And some of that still kind of lingers in our psyche as a nation, right? We know that there were people here, but we kind of think of them as just kind of being part of the landscape, right? So I want you to kind of think about what this textbook is telling us, right? It's saying that, look, there might have been people here, but they weren't what we would call civilized. They didn't do the things that people in the rest of the world was doing, right? Building cities and complex trade systems, all of that, right? Social structures. So I want to ask you, do you believe that, right? Do you agree with this textbook? And honestly, it's okay to do either, right? You can say, yes, I agree with that textbook. It makes sense to me. Native Americans weren't civilized, right? Or you could say, no, I don't believe that, right? Now, I'm going to kind of take one side here. I think you already know where I'm going with that. But it is something for you to kind of think about and consider here, right? What does it mean to be civilized? Were the Native Americans here already civilized, or did Europeans bring civilization with them, as this textbook's trying to make as a case? So what I would like you to do is just kind of stop the video for a minute and think, what does it mean to call a group of people civilized? What do you have to have as a group, as a unit, if you will, right, to actually be called civilized? So I'm going to pause here. You pause this video, stop and think about it for a minute. Try to come up with a short list, either in your head or just write it down really quick, right? And think about, what does it mean to be civilized? What would you expect a group of people to have? And then we'll kind of come back to my textbook from when I was a student in a few minutes. All right. So hopefully you're back. Hopefully you've actually done what I asked you to do and have thought about this a little bit. What does it mean to be civilized? Well, I've taken the liberty of just putting a few things on this slide to think about, but I don't think it's an exhaustive list. I don't believe it has every component that would make up a definition of being civilized. But I think there are some good, solid parts of this that we can all agree on. If you have these things, if these are present in your community, we would call you civilized. And the first one I think that we would kind of look towards is a pretty obvious one: language, right? Communication, an ability to either speak to each other or write to each other, or both, right? In optimal systems, right? is a way to communicate, right? To make sure that everybody can get on the same page, information can be transmitted throughout the unit. And usually, if that language is unique, specific to a group of people, we can start kind of saying, well, that's the bedrock of civilization. But it might not be the only component, right? There should also be some kind of societal norms, right? Some ways of acting, whether it be a way of dressing that's different than other groups of people around you, the way you assign roles in the community, whether it be gender roles or societal leadership roles, whatever those might be, actions that you consider to be appropriate, types of food you should eat, types of food you should avoid, that kind of thing, right? When you would have religious holidays, all that kind of stuff, right, could be wrapped up in this. Another thing that we would think of maybe with a civilized group, right, what defines them as being civilized is that there's some kind of governing hierarchy. Some group of people are in charge and help kind of direct the group towards a goal, if you will, right? Doesn't mean it has to be like a democratic system and an authoritarian system like we have today in our nation states. It could be very simple, just like a matriarchy or a patriarchy, right? Extended family units that have one person that kind of runs the family, if you will, or something in between these kind of extreme systems, right? But there should be some group of people that has authority in the community and makes decisions for the community, at least in some respects. Another thing I think we could all agree on is that these, to be civilized, a group of people have to have kind of rules to govern their society. And not just, that it's certain people do certain things or we dress a certain way, but it also that there are just proper modes of conduct, maybe religious conduct, that you can only do and say certain things on certain days, that you have to go to certain places at certain times, right? But also just laws or rules that make sure that the society functions and gets the job done, provides the protection, which is why society's formed in the first place, is to help provide more protection to people, to protect their property, all those kind of things. So I would think, that is another defining part of all of this, right? Maybe it comes down to territory as well, that a group of people have a distinct area that they call theirs, and it's different, it's definable from other groups of people, right? I don't think that's necessarily a strategic component of this, but it can be, right? An educational system could also be a part of this, a way to pass all of these things on. Doesn't mean it has to be like a university system like we have today here in California, but it is some way to kind of make sure that the younger generations understand what these rules are, the ways things are done in their society, right? If you have that, then it means that you have these other components that you have to be considered civilized. Maybe it's an economic system. It could be as simple as trade and barter. I give you this, you give me that. Or it could be a complex economic system like we have today based on credit. One thing I think we can say safely, though, is if you have multiple parts of what I've just listed here on this slide, we definitely would call you civilized. So now let's go back to my textbook again, right? And think about what it's saying. That textbook introduction is saying Native Americans didn't have this. That if they were here, they were essentially a part of the natural world, like the forests and the animals, right? That, yeah, sure, there were people, but they just weren't civilized like Europeans were civilized. To which I would say, how can we say they weren't, right? They had all of these things. The issue here is it was just very different indeed, right? To kind of make my point, here's some pictures here, right? Remnants of what Native Americans did before they ever ran into Europeans. This big picture up here at the top, I know it's a little difficult to make it out, but it's a pictograph from a valley in New Mexico called Chaco Canyon. And there Native Americans were living 800-900 years ago, farming and having communities, building a civilization. Why do we say that? Well, this is part of kind of their practices, right? Their social norms, if you will. They put pictographs, etchings on the side of canyon walls. I know it's a little hard to make out, but this is actually a mountain lion. And if we were to put it in a museum and put a frame around it, we'd call it a work of art, right? Same thing on this one down below, this rock, also there in New Mexico at Chaco Canyon. It's got pictures of parrots on it, right? That's what they were trying to say. Is like, we traded for some parrots and this is what they looked like, and they put it there. So if a society can be able to communicate these ideas, be able to kind of create these things, have specialists that can make these things, I think we could safely say they are civilized, right? Another great example is this picture in the upper right here. That is a plaza in what is today Mexico City, this area that was taken over by Europeans and civilized in their opinion, right? Well, before Mexico City existed, it was the capital of an Aztec empire, right? A group of Native Americans that built an extensive civilization. And the seat of their power was the city of Tenochtitlan that Mexico City literally sits on today. Some of the buildings in central Mexico City that the Spanish created to kind of run their colony of New Spain, as they called it, are literally made from the temples and buildings that the Aztecs had created there before them. You can also see things like these works of art that are just simple pottery, like people have been doing all over the world for thousands of years. This small gold statue here in the middle, right? It's made by an Incan goldsmith about 400, 500 years ago, just before the Spanish conquistadores showed up. And again, think about what it takes to make something like that. This statue is only a few inches tall, about 3 inches tall. But look at the detail work that's in it. Think about the skill that it takes to make this from raw gold. Also think about the fact that this guy didn't just figure out how to do this in one day. He was a skilled craftsman that learned this skill probably from somebody else and has practiced it over a long time. And he had to go out and buy these materials, or he was commissioned by somebody to make this item for them, right? Possibly a noble person or an important religious figure, something like that. So obviously, from a lot of this, we can see that Native Americans did have pretty complex societies. They were doing a lot of the same things that people all over the world were doing. And yet, when they run into Europeans are going to look at these Native Americans and say, you're not civilized, you're not like me, even though they're doing some of the exact same things, right? Think about it this way. This last picture I'm showing you down here in the lower left-hand column or corner of the slide, that's essentially an apartment complex, is what we would call it today. It's in northern Arizona. It's a group of Native Americans that lived there about 900 years ago, and they thrived in that area. It was much wetter back then. It was much easier to grow crops, and hundreds, probably a couple thousand Native Americans lived in this complex, growing food, living together, hunting in the area for several hundred years. So the one thing we could kind of say is this group, the Wakaputi is what they would have been called, right, or what we call them today. They had a definable area. They built structures. They obviously had some kind of societal organization to them. They had a definable language. They produced works of art, sort of like these pictographs I mentioned earlier. They're doing everything that people everywhere are doing. And yet, when Native Americans and Europeans come together, Europeans are going to look at Native Americans and say, yeah, they're not doing it right. That's not civilization. And that idea that Native Americans aren't civilized, that they're somehow, because they aren't civilized, you can treat them differently, kind of push them out of the way, that gets ingrained into our culture, right? 500 years later, there's a textbook saying the same thing that Columbus and other Europeans say in the 15th century, right? Almost in the 21st century. So this is a powerful thing that's happening here. And it's one of the things I want you to kind of think about as we go through our course, is just why are Europeans constantly look at natives and kind of see them as uncivilized? Why do they treat them the way they do? And if you kind of see that Europeans just look at Native Americans and say it's not right, and it makes it easier for them to kind of ignore what Native Americans are doing, you start to understand some of the issues that happen here and why they remain issues hundreds of years later. These ideas haven't entirely left us. They're still kind of lingering in the background because they were just ingrained in these contacts between Native Americans and Europeans from almost the very beginning, as I'll kind of lay out in the next couple of lectures. All right. So I'm going to stop here. In our next video, we'll kind of pick up the story of Native Americans. We'll kind of look at how they came to settle in North America, what their societies were and kind of like in some ways, and then we'll drill down a little bit into the way their societies actually operated and what made them so different than Europeans that it was easy for Europeans to say, we just don't agree that you're civilized. You need to be like us, and we're not going to be like you. All right, so I'll see you in our next lecture.